The cards slapped against the table with a rhythm too sharp for the sleepy sway of the midnight train, and May sat rigid in the corner, hands pressed to the thin carpet bag on her lap like it was armor. Laughter drifted from the smoking car, rough voices spilling into the passenger coach where shadows made every face look meaner. She had boarded at dusk with a ticket bought from the last of her mother's coins, thinking maybe the rails could carry her far enough that she could disappear. But men always saw her first, saw the torn hem of her skirt, the hollows under her cheekbones, the way hunger made her eyes dart too fast. To them, she was just another weary woman who could be had for cheap. "You paid for a night," one of them joked, his boots propped up on the seat as if he already owned the space around her. Another leaned forward, silver glinting in his fingers, the way gamblers flash stakes before throwing a hand down. May's throat closed. She wanted to tell them to leave her, let her fade, let her die alone the way she'd long expected to. But the words caught when a tall figure stepped into the car, blocking the swinging lamplight. He wasn't dressed like the rest. His coat was dust-streaked from trail miles, his hat bent by weather, and his face carried the kind of silence that made the men shift uncomfortably, even as they grinned. The stranger didn't sit. He walked straight to the table, pulled a single coin from his pocket, a silver dollar, worn smooth at the edges, and laid it down without a word. The laughter cut short. "Guess you'll want your night then?" the first man sneered, but his voice cracked. May lifted her chin, the old anger boiling up. She spat the words before she could stop them, her voice shaking. "You paid for a night." Her shame blistered her throat as soon as she said it. She hated the way it sounded, hated that her life had been reduced to this kind of bargain in a rail car stinking of smoke and spilled whiskey. But the stranger only looked at her, and instead of hunger in his eyes, she saw something she couldn't name, something that steadied her even as the train jolted over a crossing. He picked up the coin again and pressed it into the dealer's palm, then turned away from the table as if the matter was settled. "Come," he said, quiet but unyielding. May's legs didn't want to move, but fear pushed her up. She followed him down the narrow passage, the train groaning as if it too disapproved. He opened the door to the small sleeper cabin, the one she could never have afforded, and stood aside so she could step in. She did, clutching her bag to her chest. Then the sound of fabric startled her. He had unpinned the thick wool blanket from his own shoulders and draped it gently over her, without touching more than the air around her. The weight of it fell like a promise. He sat down by the door, boots planted wide, arms folded, and closed his eyes as if he intended to keep watch until morning. No reaching hands, no leering grins, just the low rumble of the rails and the impossible truth that a man had paid for her night only to give it back. May lay curled in that blanket, too wary to sleep, but for the first time in years her body didn't tremble with fear. She stared at the window, the darkness rushing past, and wondered if perhaps the world still had places where a soul like hers could breathe. May didn't sleep, though the rails beat a steady rhythm meant to lull weaker souls. Her eyes stayed open in the dark, watching the stranger across from her, his head bowed, brim shadowing half his face. He looked as though he'd spent years waiting in silence, the kind of man used to carrying burdens others never saw. Every time the train lurched, she half expected him to turn predator, to rise with the same hunger the others had shown. But each time, his shoulders just tightened, his arms folding more firmly across his chest, like a wall meant to keep danger out, not in. The blanket he had given her held the faint smell of smoke and pine, not perfume or drink. She drew it tighter, hating herself for wanting to keep it. When dawn began to gray the frost-bitten glass of the window, she felt the cabin shift again. Not with the train's motion, but with the weight of a truth creeping over her. He hadn't closed his eyes to sleep. He had been awake, watching through the thin crack of the doorway every time footsteps passed in the corridor. A silent guard over a woman he didn't know. And then came the twist, when the conductor rapped sharply at the door. "Tickets for the last stretch," he barked. May's fingers tightened on her bag. She had nothing but the stub already torn, proof of her desperation. If he asked again, if he demanded more, she'd have to admit she was finished. She expected the stranger to glance at her, maybe demand the payment he'd earned by saving her the night before. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Without a word, he handed the conductor a second ticket, her name scrawled across it, written in a hand she didn't recognize. "Bought at last stop," the man said, his tone flat, leaving no room for questions. The conductor frowned but nodded, clipped both stubs, and moved on. May stared at him, her throat tight. "Why?" she whispered. The word scraped raw. He didn't look at her, only adjusted the brim of his hat. "Figured you'd need another mile." She almost laughed, though it came out more like a sob. No one ever gave her another mile. Men gave her bargains, threats, bruises. They gave her nights to regret and mornings to flee. But this man, he gave her distance, the kind of gift no one could put a price on. She wanted to ask his name, but the train lurched again, and voices rose from the next car, angry, familiar, the same men from before, realizing she had slipped from their grip. Her pulse spiked, heat rising in her chest. He opened one eye, calm as stone. "Stay behind me," he said, as if he'd known they'd follow. May shrank back, the blanket slipping to the floor as the door banged open, and the gamblers spilled in, teeth bared, silver still flashing in their fists. One pointed at her like she was a prize. "You ain't worth more than the coin we laid down. Hand her over." Her breath hitched, panic clawing her throat. But the stranger didn't move from his chair. He looked at them with that same heavy silence, and for a heartbeat, May thought he might draw a gun. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let the coin he'd given them the night before roll across his knuckles in the gray light of dawn. "That dollar was the last you'll ever take for her," he said, voice low and final. The car rocked, the rails screaming beneath, and May realized she was standing on the edge of a moment that could rewrite her whole life. The gamblers sneered, the leader pushing forward with a scar slicing across his cheek like a crooked grin. His hand twitched toward the knife on his belt, and May felt her breath lock in her chest. She'd seen this play before. Men cornering, threats turning to violence, her voice useless against fists. Her knees trembled as the train swayed, metal wheels screaming on the tracks, the smell of iron and smoke sharp in her nostrils. But the man in the hat didn't flinch. He sat forward, still rolling the silver dollar across his knuckles, his eyes never leaving the scarred man's. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the clatter like steel striking flint. "You had your chance last night. Took your money. Walk away." His calmness was more dangerous than any threat May had ever heard. It wasn't bluff, it was verdict. The scarred man's smirk faltered, but pride pushed him. "She's ours. A ticket don't change that." He lunged, hand flashing for the knife. May gasped, shrinking against the wall. The stranger rose in one motion, taller than she'd realized, and in the confined space of the cabin he didn't reach for steel. He caught the man's wrist mid-swing, twisting until the blade clattered to the floor. The train jolted over a switch in the tracks, throwing the others off balance. In that chaos, the stranger shoved the scarred man back into his own crowd. May's heart hammered as bodies slammed against the doorframe, curses breaking over the roar of wheels. "Out," the stranger ordered, his voice steady. but his stance braced like stone ready to break. The gamblers hesitated, fear cracking their bravado. They weren't facing a drunk or a weak rancher. They were staring at someone who had nothing to prove but everything to end them if pressed. One spat on the floor, venom in his eyes. "Ain't over, Cowboy." He shoved the scarred man toward the corridor, the others trailing with muttered threats, slamming the door so hard May jumped. Silence fell except for the pounding rails. May realized she was gripping the armrest so tightly her nails had left marks. Her whole body shook. Shame burning hot. Shame that she'd frozen. Shame that he had stood for her when she'd done nothing. He bent down, picked up the knife, and set it carefully on the seat beside him, as though it were no more dangerous than a bent nail. Then he sat, folding his arms, as though the storm hadn't just passed through. May's voice broke out before she could stop it. "Why do you keep helping me?" Her words came ragged, a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, because men never gave without taking. He turned his head slightly, eyes catching the thin slice of dawn through the frosted glass. "Because you asked to be left alone," he said, voice low. "And nobody listened." The words pierced her more sharply than any blade. He had heard her plea, the one she had thrown like a stone in the dark, certain no one cared. She wanted to speak, but her throat closed, and tears she hadn't felt in years threatened to spill. She bit them back, clutching the blanket as if it were armor. The train whistled ahead, a long, aching cry into the morning. She thought it was over, until she saw through the window figures waiting at the next station, shadows hard against the platform. The gamblers hadn't given up. They had friends. And the moment the wheels ground to a halt, she knew the danger wasn't behind them. It was waiting ahead. The train screeched as brakes locked, steel crying against steel, and May felt the jolt run through her bones. The stranger didn't move, though she saw his jaw tighten, the only sign he'd noticed the shapes gathering on the platform outside. Men, 5 at least, leaning with the casual stance of predators who know their prey can't run. The scarred gambler was among them, pointing toward her window with a smile that made her blood cold. May clutched the wool blanket around her shoulders, the coarse fibers scratching her neck, her mind racing through every escape she never had. Her stomach knotted as the door to the cabin rattled. The stranger stood, slow, deliberate, and tilted his hat lower over his brow. He placed the silver dollar on the seat beside her like a marker, as though to say, "I'll be back for this." The door slid open before she could ask anything, and a uniformed conductor poked his head in. His voice was polite but stiff, hiding something behind the practiced lines of a man caught in someone else's game. "Sir, ma'am, there's a matter to settle on the platform." His eyes flicked nervously at May, then darted away. The stranger nodded once. "I'll handle it." May wanted to shout at him not to go, wanted to tell him she couldn't watch another man vanish into violence while she was left with scraps of safety. But her throat locked. He stepped past the conductor, out into the corridor, boots striking with even weight. May pressed her face to the glass, heart hammering, watching as he stepped onto the wooden planks of the station platform. The gambler's allies straightened. The scarred man grinned wide, spreading his arms as though greeting an old friend. Their words were lost in the hiss of steam and the shuffle of passengers craning for a better look. But May read it in their bodies. Taunt, challenge, trap. She turned back, mind racing. If he fought them, 5 against 1, he'd be cut down, and then she would be dragged back into the dark she had been running from all along. Her fingers brushed the knife he had left on the seat, the cold iron biting her skin. Her reflection in the glass startled her. Eyes wild, hair tangled, a woman no longer hiding under silence but trembling at the edge of action. She shoved the blade into the folds of the blanket, stood, and pushed past the conductor into the corridor. The crowd thickened near the doors, whispers swirling. "What's going on? Looks like a duel." "Outlaws, I reckon." May forced herself through, the blanket trailing, her pulse roaring like the locomotive's engine. On the platform, the scarred gambler was circling the stranger, words spilling like poison while the others flanked, hands itching at their belts. The stranger stood still, watching, waiting for the break. May's breath burned her lungs as she stepped down onto the platform. The wood planks shuddered with every motion around her, but she barely felt it. She knew this was the moment, the one that would decide whether she lived as a shadow or dared to step into the open. The scarred man's gaze caught her. His grin widened, teeth yellow in the weak dawn light. "There she is," he crowed loud enough for every passenger to hear. "His silver can't buy what we already own." The crowd gasped, murmurs spreading like brush fire. May felt every eye on her, but all she saw was the stranger's face as he finally moved, just enough to shift his body between her and the men. His hand hovered near his coat. She could almost feel the tension trembling in the air. The whistle blew sharp, echoing like a warning shot. And May realized she had only one choice: to hide again, or to stand where everyone could see and declare she was not theirs to take. May's voice tore free before she even realized she was speaking, raw and jagged from years of silence. "I am not for sale." The words cracked through the station like a gunshot, slicing the gambler's laughter into stunned quiet. The scarred man blinked, then barked out a laugh as though her defiance were a child's tantrum, but May felt the weight shift. Every passenger leaning out of windows, every farmer with his satchel, and every mother with her brood, every soul froze, watching her. The gambler's allies faltered, their boots scraping as uncertainty rippled through their stance. The stranger didn't move, but she saw the muscle in his jaw flex, the faintest acknowledgement of her stand. May's knees trembled beneath the blanket, but she pressed on, her throat raw. "This man," she gestured to the stranger, "paid silver not to buy me, but to stop you from owning me. He gave me a night of peace, and I'll stand with him, not you." The scarred gambler's smile curdled into something sharper, uglier. He spat on the boards and took a step closer, his hand brushing the grip of his pistol. "You think a blanket makes you free, girl? You think one rancher's coin changes who holds the reins?" He sneered at the crowd, daring them to disagree. "She's been bought a dozen times before. This ain't any different." Gasps rippled from the passengers, murmurs spreading. But May stepped forward, closer to the stranger's shoulder. She didn't flinch when the gambler's words cut into her. She had lived with chains of shame long enough, and now, in the cold dawn air, she felt the first breath of freedom in her chest. The stranger finally spoke, his voice calm as a low river current. "You're wrong. This is different." He shifted his stance, slow and steady, his coat pulling back to reveal the glint of steel at his side. "Because this time, I'm here." The scarred gambler's eyes narrowed, and May felt the crowd hold its breath. The world seemed to shrink, pressing all its weight into this single stretch of wooden planks. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a sound broke the tension. Not a gunshot, not a scream, but the piercing whinny of a colt from the freight car behind them. The young horse May had heard thrashing earlier kicked at the walls, the echo reverberating like a drumbeat. It was wild, untamed, and furious at its cage. The sound jolted May like a spark. She thought of herself, thought of every cage she had survived, and her voice steadied. "I'll not go back with you," she said, louder now, steady. "I would rather walk into the wilderness with nothing but this blanket than crawl under your boots again." The crowd erupted in murmurs, some shocked, some emboldened, some whispering prayers. The gambler's sneer twisted into rage, his hand curling tight around the pistol at his hip. May saw it before it happened, the glint of violence in his eyes, and instinct made her grab the stranger's arm. Her fingers dug into his sleeve, anchoring her to him as though by holding on she could will him to survive what was coming. The scarred man spat again, growled low, and drew. The crowd screamed. May braced, heart slamming against her ribs, knowing this was the moment everything would either shatter or be remade. The stranger's hand moved, faster than hers could even follow, and in that split second between the draw and the shot, May's fate hung suspended in the cold air of the station. The pistol cleared the gambler's holster, but the stranger's hand was already in motion, steel flashing in the gray dawn. May flinched at the deafening crack, the sound tearing through her bones like a storm breaking over stone. The gambler's shot went wide, splintering a post behind them, but the stranger's bullet drove straight through the gambler's shoulder, spinning him back against the railing with a howl. For a heartbeat, silence fell, thick and stunned, as if the world itself hesitated to breathe. Then chaos erupted. The gambler's allies drew iron, 3 guns glinting as they scrambled to fire. The stranger shoved May behind him, the blanket whipping loose as he spun, his revolver barking twice more. One man toppled into the dust with a curse, another stumbled screaming as his hat flew off, blood running down his arm. The third fired wild, a bullet screaming past May's ear, close enough she felt the air burn. Passengers shrieked, scattering across the platform, clutching children stumbling over baggage. May pressed against the wood siding, her heart hammering, every nerve screaming to run, yet her eyes locked on the stranger. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He moved like water through stone, every step calculated, every pull of the trigger deliberate. His coat flared with each motion, a shadow cutting through the storm of smoke and gunpowder. The gambler, pale and snarling, forced himself upright, blood soaking his sleeve, and shouted through clenched teeth, "She belongs to me!" His words rang out even over the roar of chaos, as if he believed claiming her loudly enough would make it true. Rage flared hot in May's chest. Belongs. The word echoed through her skull, ripping at scars carved deep in her spirit. She pushed off the wall, her bare feet slapping against the boards, and stumbled toward him before reason could stop her. "I am not yours!" she cried, her voice cutting through the din like a whip crack. The gambler raised his pistol with his good arm, aiming straight at her chest. And in that moment, May thought she had run too far, too fast. But the stranger was already there, his revolver smoking, his voice low and hard. "No, she's not." His final shot slammed into the gambler's wrist, the weapon flying from his grasp and clattering uselessly across the planks. The man screamed, cradling his ruined hand, stumbling backward into the arms of his last ally who half-dragged, half-carried him away toward the freight cars. The fight was over in minutes, yet May's ears rang as though cannon had fired beside her. Smoke hung in the air, acrid and heavy, mingling with the sharp tang of blood and sweat. Her knees gave out, dropping her to the boards, but she kept her gaze fixed on the stranger. He slid his gun back into the holster, shoulders rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. His eyes found hers, steady, searching, as though he wasn't asking if she was hurt, but if she could still stand, still claim her voice. May swallowed hard, clutching the frayed edge of the blanket that had fallen at her feet. Her chest heaved with a strange mix of terror and awe. Around them the crowd crept back, whispers rippling like wind through grass, carrying her words, his defense, the gunfire. She knew then that something had shifted, not just in the station, not just in her. but in the way the world would now see her. The gambler had shouted his claim, and she had shouted it down. The stranger had fired steel into the lie. May's heart still rattled like the train engine warming in the distance, but inside her a seed of fire had taken root. She was no longer a shadow trailing behind men's bargains. She was standing in her own name. And the story wasn't finished yet. Dust still swirled across the depot when the sheriff's boots thudded onto the platform, spurs jangling sharp in the uneasy quiet. His hat brim shadowed hard eyes that swept over the shaken passengers, the crumpled gambler being dragged into a freight car, and finally the stranger standing tall with smoke curling faint from his holster. May clutched the wool blanket to her chest, her heart pounding, her mind still echoing with the thunder of shots. The sheriff's gaze landed on her, lingered, then shifted back to the stranger with a sharpness that felt like a blade being measured. "Well," the sheriff drawled, voice low, steady. "Someone better tell me why there's blood all over my platform." His tone made it clear he wanted answers, not excuses. The crowd parted nervously, all eyes flicking toward May and the stranger, their whispers tugging like hands on her shoulders. She wanted to vanish, to let the earth swallow her, but the stranger stepped forward before silence could crush her voice. "They tried to take her," he said, simple, unadorned. His words dropped into the tension like stones breaking ice. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He looked at May, his expression neither cruel nor kind, just watchful. "That true?" May's throat felt raw, but she forced herself upright, fingers knotting in the blanket. The word belongs still burned in her skull, but now another word pressed against her lips, heavier, harder. Truth. She swallowed once, then lifted her chin. "Yes, he said I belonged to him, but I don't." The crowd shifted, gasps and mutters sparking. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, then softened just slightly, something unreadable flickering across his face. He nodded once, as if her words mattered more than he'd expected. "Good," he said, "'cause nobody belongs to anybody in this town." Then his tone hardened again, as he turned toward the gambler's trail of blood. "Drag them back here," he barked to his deputies. "They'll answer proper." As the lawman moved off, May swayed, her body finally feeling the toll of the night, but the stranger's steady hand touched her elbow, anchoring her. The warmth of his palm cut through the cold that had clung to her bones since she'd stepped off the train. "You spoke for yourself," he murmured, low enough only she could hear. His words weren't praise, they were recognition, as if he'd been waiting for her to do it. Her eyes stung, not from smoke, but from something sharp and new. Pride, fragile but alive. She nodded once, too breathless to answer. The sheriff turned back, his gaze landing heavy on the stranger. "Name?" "Elias," the stranger said. No hesitation. No disguise. Just a man claiming his own space in the world. The sheriff grunted. "You know what you did? Here's gonna stir trouble. Men like him don't take kindly to losing what they think they own." "Let them stir," Elias replied, calm but firm. May felt the weight of his words sink into her like coals pressed against frost. For the first time, the storm wasn't just around her. It was shifting away from her, toward him, toward anyone who dared put a chain on her again. The sheriff studied them both for a long moment, then finally tipped his hat. "Stay close. Folks will be talking." With that, he moved off to manage the dispersing crowd, his presence heavy as the smoke still hanging in the air. May's knees wobbled, but she stood, clinging to the blanket and the single truth she had spoken aloud. The gambler's voice still echoed in her head, but so did Elias's shot, her own cry, and the sheriff's verdict. She realized she had crossed something invisible and irreversible. And as the train whistled low and mournful, she knew the next steps would either burn away the chains completely or forge new ones stronger than before. The night air outside the depot carried the faint bite of iron and smoke, the echoes of gunfire still clinging to the timbers like a smell that would not wash away. Elias guided May across the narrow yard toward a small line shack behind the freight house, a place offered by the sheriff for the night, until the train could be cleared to move on. Inside, the air was close with the scent of old wood and dust, but there was a hearth, and Elias struck flint until sparks caught, feeding flame into a low blaze. May sank onto a rough stool, pulling the wool blanket close around her shoulders, its weight both comfort and reminder. The fire's light danced across her face, softening the edges of her weariness, yet sharpening the hollows carved by years of silence and struggle. She did not look at him at first, but the warmth seemed to draw words from her chest like smoke rising unbidden. "You wonder why I came here," she said, voice quiet, brittle. "Why men think they can lay claim to me as if I were cattle." Her fingers traced the frayed edge of the blanket, her gaze lost in the fire's restless motion. Elias leaned against the wall, arms folded, letting her speak. His silence an open space she could fill without fear. "My husband was gone before our vows were ever worth anything. He drank himself into the ground, left debts like weeds that grew faster than I could pull. The men who came collecting said a woman alone was payment enough. I ran. I thought the train would carry me farther than their reach, but wolves wear boots, and they hunt even through smoke and steel." She stopped, breath shuddering, eyes glistening but dry. The flames snapped softly, the crackle a sound that seemed to urge her on. "When he grabbed me tonight, called me his, part of me almost let him. Almost thought it would be easier to stop fighting, to just disappear into what they wanted me to be. But then you stepped between, and I heard myself say no. First time I'd said it aloud and meant it." Her voice broke there, not in sobs, but in the kind of rawness that comes from tearing down walls built too long. Elias shifted, stepping closer, the firelight catching the planes of his face, the shadow of his beard. He knelt, not as a supplicant, but as a man bringing himself level, his eyes steady and warm. "You don't owe them anything," he said, words threaded with a quiet force. "Not your name, not your body, not the marrow in your bones. You belong where you choose, and if you choose nowhere, that's still yours." May's throat ached, her hands trembling as if her own skin no longer fit right. She had been told so many things by men with louder voices, with fists and debts and endless claims, yet no one had ever spoken of choice as if it could be hers. For a long while they stayed like that, the fire whispering, the shadows drawing long on the walls. The blanket slipped slightly from her shoulder, and Elias adjusted it, careful, deliberate, as if the smallest gesture carried weight enough to mend years of breaking. When the silence stretched too far, May finally looked at him. "And you? What chains follow you?" The question caught him, and though he did not answer at once, his eyes darkened with something heavy, unspoken. He stood then, pacing slow, as if her words had tugged at a cord he wasn't ready to unravel. His silence, for the first time, carried secrets rather than space. The fire spat a single spark upward, and May's heart thumped with sudden unease. His chains, she realized, might prove as dangerous as the ones she had just broken. The knock wasn't a knock at all, but the thunder of a boot striking wood, the door of the line shack shuddering on its hinges. Elias was already moving, dragging May behind the table just as voices outside rang sharp, fueled by drink and vengeance. "You think you can rob us, rancher? Think you can buy what we already marked as ours? Another kick splintered the frame. The sheriff had warned him not all of the gambler's friends had been caught. Men with nothing left but bitterness and whiskey, dangerous for their emptiness. Elias's hand went to the Colt at his hip, but May saw the way his jaw tightened, not just from threat but from memory, as if the men outside were phantoms pulling him back into chains he hadn't spoken of. The fire behind them cracked, casting restless shadows. May clutched the blanket tighter, heart battering her ribs. She whispered, urgent, "You don't have to face them alone." Elias didn't answer, but his silence was different now, full of weight instead of calm. The door gave way with a final groan, splinters scattering like sparks, and 3 men staggered in, faces roughened by the night, pistols gleaming under firelight. The one in front sneered at May, then at Elias. "Step aside," she was promised. Elias rose slow, the firelight crawling up his frame, the Colt drawn but low. His voice came steady, almost quiet. "No one's promised to you. Not anymore." For a heartbeat the men wavered, until one laughed, bitter. The knock wasn't a knock at all, but the thunder of a boot striking wood, the door of the line shack shuddering on its hinges. Elias was already moving, dragging May behind the table just as voices outside rang sharp, fueled by drink and vengeance. "You think you can rob us, rancher? Think you can buy what we already marked as ours?" Another kick splintered the frame. The sheriff had warned him not all of the gambler's friends had been caught. Men with nothing left but bitterness and whiskey, dangerous for their emptiness. Elias's hand went to the Colt at his hip, but May saw the way his jaw tightened, not just from threat but from memory, as if the men outside were phantoms pulling him back into chains he hadn't spoken of. The fire behind them cracked, casting restless shadows. May clutched the blanket tighter, heart battering her ribs. She whispered, urgent, "You don't have to face them alone." Elias didn't answer, but his silence was different now, full of weight instead of calm. The door gave way with a final groan, splinters scattering like sparks, and 3 men staggered in, faces roughened by the night, pistols gleaming under firelight. The one in front sneered at May, then at Elias. "Step aside, she was promised." Elias rose slow, the firelight crawling up his frame, the Colt drawn but low. His voice came steady, almost quiet. "No one's promised to you. Not anymore." For a heartbeat the men wavered, until one laughed, bitter. "Always the righteous one. Haven't changed a bit, Elias Ward. Or should I say deserter?" May's head snapped toward him, confusion flaring. Elias didn't flinch, though his knuckles whitened on the grip. The man grinned wider, pleased to wound. "You think you can hide in cabins, in small towns, behind widows? I remember you running when it mattered, leaving men in mud while you carried your own hide to safety." May's breath hitched, the fire snapping loud in the silence that followed. Elias didn't deny it. His eyes stayed locked on the intruders, but his shoulders sagged under a truth she hadn't expected, the quiet strength she'd leaned on suddenly fractured by shame. The blanket around her felt heavier, not from comfort but from the weight of what it meant, that the man who had stood between her and ruin carried his own brand of cowardice in his bones. The intruder raised his gun, smirking. "Let's see if you run again." Elias moved then, sudden and sharp, the Colt bucking with a sound that tore the room. The bullet struck the lantern on the shelf, glass shattering, flames spilling in an arc across the floor. Fire leapt like a beast freed, scattering the men backward with curses. Smoke curled, biting at their eyes. May crawled low, coughing, her hand brushing Elias's sleeve. He hauled her toward the rear door, the world inside filling with orange fury. Behind them, the men stumbled, some firing blindly, their shots drowned by the roar of fire consuming old wood. Outside, the night was cold and sharp, the stars above indifferent to the chaos. May bent double, lungs heaving while Elias braced against the shack's wall, his face drawn, eyes dark not from smoke alone. She wanted to demand truth, to ask if he had really left men to die, but the words tangled with the rawness of her gratitude and fear. Instead, she clutched his arm. "Whatever chains you carry," she rasped, "they don't get to drag us back." He looked at her then, not with relief, but with something unguarded, fragile as the sparks still rising behind them. And for the first time she saw the man who could break as easily as he could shield. The shack collapsed in a chorus of sparks and falling beams, the fire consuming what little safety the night had offered. Elias pulled May back from the spray of embers, his body bent as though he could shield her from everything, even the past clawing at him. The three intruders had fled into the dark, coughing curses swallowed by the crackle of flame, leaving behind only smoke and the sour echo of their words. May clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders, its wool scratchy against her skin, and when she looked at Elias, his face was raw with something deeper than fear. He wouldn't meet her eyes at first, staring instead at the blaze as if it were a mirror of every mistake he carried. At last, in a voice rough as stone, he said, "They weren't lying, May. I ran once, left men bleeding in mud while I lived. That's the truth of me." The fire's light flickered across his face, painting the hollows of his eyes. May listened, chest heavy, but she didn't shrink away. Instead, she shifted closer, the blanket sliding from her shoulder onto his arm. Her voice came soft but firm, steady as a tether. "You didn't run tonight." The words caught him off guard, and he turned toward her, the heat behind them making his features stark. She continued, each syllable striking like hammer to iron. "You stood between me and them when you could have walked away. You gave me warmth when no one else would give me dignity. Whatever ghosts you carry, Elias, they don't own you anymore." For a moment he looked like a man drowning, pulled under by both shame and hope, uncertain which to reach for. Then his shoulders lowered, as if her words had cut through a weight he'd worn too long. He reached out, hesitant, and laid the edge of the blanket fully across her again, tucking it firm around her arms. "It was never about buying a night," he murmured. "It was about giving you one where you didn't have to fight." May's throat ached, her eyes stinging from smoke and something sharper. She wanted to tell him what that night had meant, how it had stitched a wound inside her she hadn't even known was still bleeding. Instead, she leaned into him, the blanket binding them both, the fire's glow throwing their shadows long across the clearing. Behind them, the shack burned itself to ash, the old wood collapsing in surrender. It felt like more than timber falling. It felt like the past Elias had carried finally breaking apart, its chains melted in the flames. As dawn edged faint and silver on the horizon, the world smelled of smoke and frost, of endings and beginnings braided together. Elias lifted his eyes to the pale light, and then looked down at May, who was watching him with something unshaken, a faith that startled him more than Gunfire ever had. He placed his hand over hers, calloused palm against her smaller grip. "I don't know if I deserve another start," he said low. May's answer came without hesitation, quiet but fierce. "Then take mine." The first bird of morning cut through the silence with a sharp cry, and together they stood, wrapped in the same wool, facing the ashes and the road beyond. The blanket, singed at its edges, clung around them like a promise. That sometimes salvation wasn't in running from the past, but in sharing its weight until it no longer crushed one soul alone.